Hi, this is Amy from Good Food Unearthed, and today I'm here with ER. And ER is in Ontario, and he has written an excellent document outlining the list of violations based on the Criminal Code of Canada. And we're going to look at some other statutes as well. And these are against the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario. So I'd like to welcome ER. Welcome to the channel.
Well, hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, it's wonderful to have you on because I think it's important to outline what exactly has happened and how there can actually be criminal charges brought against the lieutenant governor and why there's a focus on the lieutenant governor. You are specifically in Ontario, so that's your province that you're focusing on. So why don't we go ahead and we'll start with that. Why don't you talk about what the position of the lieutenant governor is and why you're focusing on her?
Okay, so the Lieutenant Governor was the one who made the declaration of emergency in Ontario.
Mm-hmm.
And the important sentence in the declaration of emergency on March 17th, 2020 was, and whereas the criteria set out in subsection 7.0.1 bracket 3 of the Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act have been satisfied.
Mm-hmm.
And that is all about the resources. It talks about the resources that the government of Ontario or a health agency has or doesn't have, as well as whether the resources will be effective enough or timely enough, or whether it's certain to have any effect
Mm-hmm.
on the emergency. So that is the main thing right there. When you look up 7.0.1 bracket 3, and again, it's about the resources. It was never demonstrably justified at the time of the declaration of emergency.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, there was only one death and one illness in Canada at that point. So there was no reason for a lockdown or a declaration of emergency.
Mm-hmm.
As well, the report on the 129-day declaration of emergency never once discussed the resources in section 7.0.1 bracket 3 of the Emergency Management Civil Protection Act, nor the criteria, nor the circumstances regarding the need for a declaration of emergency. So therefore, it's never been stated as to why, explained why, and under oath or any information, any evidence. It's, I saw a ghost, everybody stay inside, but I won't tell you about the ghost. I won't tell you about the audio, the video, or anything I have about the ghost. I just saw a ghost, everybody do what I tell you.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a hoax.
Right. So we'll get into
And
that
that
to
falls
talk
into the
about.
criminal code.
That's right. We'll get into
Mhm.
that. But so specifically, the lieutenant governor is the one who has to sign off on the declaration of emergency. So she in your province and in the other provinces, they're the ones who are responsible for signing those declarations. They're the ones who basically are liable for what's going on. Is that correct?
Yes, like in the
Okay.
Reopening Act in Ontario,
Mm-hmm.
it also states, which the Lieutenant Governor enacted, it also states that the Lieutenant Governor may by order extend an order,
Mm-hmm.
the Lieutenant Governor may by order revoke an order. So it's
Right.
all the Lieutenant Governor. People here in
Okay.
Ontario like to bash Doug Ford. It's not
Yes.
Doug Ford, it's the Lieutenant Governor.
Right. So, and if anybody's, I have an image here of the notice of liability from 369 Media, which talks just about what ER was talking about right now. And they mention here in the Ontario notice of liability, and it's directed to the Lieutenant Governor, that at the time of the first announced lockdown, Canada's population was approximately 38 million, and there were only two COVID-19 related deaths at that time, meaning all provincial and territorial declarations were excessive, unreasonable, and unjustified. And it goes on from there and talks about March 17, 2020, Premier Ford made a declaration of emergency. And of course, the lieutenant governor has to sign off on that. So you can go ahead and read that there. That this information is also included in ER's document, and I'll provide a link to that in the description. So let's talk about something that a lot of people
I
will
don't
bring up
believe that
though. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't believe that it was the premier who made the declaration of emergency.
Hmm.
The premier announced it. I don't think the premier made the declaration, because in the Emergency Management Civil Protection Act, if the premier does make a declaration of emergency, the statute says he has up to 72 hours for it to be verified by the lieutenant governor. I've asked for copies of any of the declared emergencies, and I only have the lieutenant governor's signature on a declaration of emergency. So I think the premier only reported a declaration of emergency and did not create a declaration of emergency.
Okay. Yeah.
It was the lieutenant governor.
Yeah, that would be even a stronger case to address this to the lieutenant governor. So the next thing that I want to bring up
Mhm.
is the Health Protection and Promotion Act. This one is specifically to Ontario, but I know other provinces have mirrored acts that are pretty much like this one. And I just want to bring this up because people will use this as a justification for everything that's going on. But it seems to me that what we've done is we've taken this act, this statute, and made this into the supreme law of Canada. And what I've got outlined here on this page is what can happen, what may be included in this order, such as requiring an owner or occupier of a premises to close the premises and so on. And this overrides constitutional law. It overrides the Healthcare Consent Act. It overrides the Emergencies Act. It overrides the Patient Rights Act in Ontario, and it overrides the human rights acts and codes in other provinces. And just as an outline, this is some of the sections of that act that state that the Healthcare Consent Act does not apply, such as if a physician examination of a person pursuant to an order under this section, requiring the person to submit to the examination by a physician, and so on. And it also, what's important in this one too, I noticed though, is that it says that the minister, and they're talking about the ministers of health, may publish guidelines for the provision of mandatory health programs and services, but they state that a guideline is not a regulation, and that in the event of conflict between a regulation and a guideline, the regulation prevails. So I don't know, Jack, have you looked into this act itself, and what have you found about it?
Well, my answer to that is Section 52, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Okay.
The Constitution of Canada is the supreme law of Canada, and any law that is inconsistent with the provisions of the Constitution is, to the extent of the inconsistency, of no force or effect. And that
Absolutely.
would be inconsistent.
Yeah, and the Canadian government website actually has this on there in their information on the charter, and they have that statement: the Constitution is the supreme law of Canada. All other laws must be consistent with the rules set out in it. If they are not, they may not be valid. So one of the things people talk about is that, well, your rights are not absolute, and you can infringe upon some of the rights. But you have some information about that.
Well, I mean, the supremacy of God is the first line in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Hmm.
I was not born for anybody other than my mother and father.
Hmm.
And so I have natural rights, etc. Government does not own anybody. Government is a fiction that is created and shall not be above a human being.
Hmm. Yeah. And
I don't know what else to say about that.
well, I do know as well that the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms talks about in Section 1 of the Charter, when they state that if there is a need to infringe upon any of the charter rights, there have to be stipulations that need to be met. So what has been revealed is that none of these stipulations were ever met. So even stating that there can be infringements only if these stipulations are met, they still have not met any of those stipulations. So one of the things I want to get into before we
Okay,
talk
so
about, yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, murder has been committed. I say that lockdown suicides become murder under Section 229 of the Canadian Criminal Code. So I accuse the Lieutenant Governor of murder, Section 229, subsection C,
Yeah,
murder.
and what
And
I'm
we
gonna
need to
do
focus on
now,
murder.
yeah, what I'm gonna do now is just give a brief outline of the COVID measures because that's what we're gonna focus on as violations, and then we're gonna go into first, I want to address the Constitution Act, and then we're going to go into the Criminal Code of Canada and the violations there. So the measures that we're talking about are the isolation, quarantine, social distancing, the business closures, and the other implementations businesses had to do, such as reduced capacity, reduced hours, the PPE, the masks, the curbside pickup, online ordering, and so on. The testing, the contact tracing, surveillance apps, and digital monitoring, mask mandates, and bylaws, antibacterial soaps being used excessively, excessive hand washing, restrictions on travel, religious places of worship closed, school closures, and increased digital classrooms. And for more on this, I'm going to provide a link to the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms document, their PDF document, Flying Blind, which outlines the harms caused by the lockdown, showing that actually the fatality rate from the lockdowns compared to those that have been outlined and are stated as data statistics on the government websites that are associated to COVID. When you compare that to the fatalities from lockdowns, the lockdowns compared to COVID associated deaths are 12 to 1. So we'll go into that. But first, we're going to jump into the Constitution Act, which we already just touched on briefly. But I wonder if you could enlighten us a bit more on this act that you have in your document. You actually have the Constitution Act of 1867 and 1982.
Right. So I put in 1867 only to show that the Queen pretty much controls and owns everything.
Mm-hmm.
The 1982 version, Section 1, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. Nothing has been demonstrably justified.
Mm-hmm.
The report on the 129-day declaration of emergency that was tabled within 130 days of the termination of the declaration of emergency, again, never once discussed the resources that were mentioned in the declaration of emergency under section 7.0.1 bracket 3, nor did it discuss the circumstances or the criteria for making such declaration, and never was it ever disclosed to the public. And we also now, because that was an unlawful act, and there are lockdown suicides, it becomes murder. And so I again point my finger to the Lieutenant Governor. I asked the police to lawfully take into custody the Lieutenant Governor for section 229 subsection C, murder.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's go into the criminal code violations. And you have this outlined in your document really well. Sure. You have a kind of a summary at the beginning, and then you also go into it later on in your document, and you have certain things like reckless endangerment, criminal negligence, torture, hoax. So let's outline those.
Yes.
And talk about why,
Okay.
just give a brief thing about why there's been a violation.
Okay, so the document that you're referring to is basically an information. It's something that you could follow the format of if you wanted to file a private prosecution against against someone criminally. The way you would do it is at the JP office, the Justice of the Peace office. Mm-hmm. It's an information that would be given to the criminal court, and somebody would be prosecuted criminally. So the documentation here is styled in the same form as an information to file with the JP office. It's also similarly styled as a police officer would style the information to the criminal court system if someone was being charged immediately by a police officer. It has the names of the accused, the address of the accused, and the particulars of the offense. date, location, and the offenses alleged, as well as any other kind of commentary. And so in the offenses alleged, that is where it is written out in kind of as English as possible as to what actually happened. And then later on in that document, I actually have the actual criminal code violations as reference to verify the narrative of the offenses alleged. So the offenses alleged, and I'll just quickly say them in no particular order: reckless endangerment of children, child abuse, elder abuse, and I'm talking about the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, Elizabeth Doddswell, healthy people abuse, inhumane acts on civilian populations, which is a definition of a crime against humanity, life in prison for the Lieutenant Governor, Elizabeth Doddswell, bodily harm, failing to obey a statute, torture, for which every element of torture has been satisfied. And if there's, and then domestic terrorism and hoax regarding terrorism. And for the terrorism, if there is a death, for which there is deaths regarding lockdown suicide, which is also section 229, bracket C of the Criminal Code, murder. But because there's a death in domestic terrorism, it would be life in prison for the Lieutenant Governor, Elizabeth Doddswell, as well as murder, section 229 of the Canadian Criminal Code, murder.
Okay.
And there are other things that I discuss in it, and go on.
Oh, no, go ahead.
So I can get into some of the details regarding some of those. Okay, so for example, and I want to state murder first, just as the Lieutenant Governor is responsible for lockdown suicides becoming murder. But I'm going to start with a document here that I'm just basically going to read. Section 83.01 bracket 1 bracket 3.231 bracket 1 of the Canadian Criminal Code. So the Lieutenant Governor and Premier.
Hold on 1 second. So I think let's state that again,
Sure.
Because I think when you pulled up the document, it messed with the audio. So we missed the actual section.
Okay, section 83.01 bracket 1 bracket B.
Yep.
And section 83.231 bracket 1 of the Canadian Criminal Code, domestic terrorism and hoax regarding terrorism. Did you get that?
Yep, perfect.
Okay. So the Lieutenant Governor and the Premier, because the Premier is the sidekick, did cause public intimidation with regards to its security, including economic security, causing persons to do or refrain from doing any act, such as freedom of assembly, freedom of the right to the gaining of a livelihood, freedom to not breathe in one's own carbon dioxide, among many other things. This recklessly endangered the lives of children, the elderly, the vulnerable, and the healthy segment of the population. The Lieutenant Governor and the Premier also did cause serious disruption and interference of essential services. The Lieutenant Governor and Premier, more the Lieutenant Governor, never supplied sworn records or sworn proof of the criteria, resources, and circumstances for a declaration of emergency, and never did this under oath. So the declaration of emergency relied on section 7.0.1 bracket 3 subparagraph 2, which talked about the resources. So because nothing's ever been disclosed, it's thereby deemed a hoax without anything being demonstrably justified as required by section 1 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So the Lieutenant Governor, I'm going to stick with the Lieutenant Governor. The Lieutenant Governor acted with intention and wanton and reckless disregard for the lives of the population. That 129-day declaration of emergency report did not divulge the resources, criteria, and circumstances for the declaration of emergency, nor was it ever divulged under oath to the population at any point. So it can easily be said that the resources in question in section 7.0.1 bracket 3 subparagraph 2 were staples and paper clips. Because it was never disclosed, not in the report and not to the public. So it was, I claim it's staples and paper clips, and we had a declaration of emergency for that? No. So they failed to disclose any information on it, and they also failed to disclose records containing proof that the alleged SARS-CoV-2 virus in fact exists. Also, deaths are included whether or not COVID-19 was determined to be a contributing or underlying cause of death, as indicated in the IPHIS field type of death. And that can be verified on page 14 of a website on ontario.ca. Also, to kind of further prove it's a hoax, because we're talking about hoax regarding terrorism, I'm going to quote Dr. Fauci. There is no question that there will be a challenge to the coming administration in the arena of infectious diseases. The thing we're extraordinarily confident about is that we're going to see this in the next few years. So I'm just going to get back to some of the essential services that were seriously disrupted and interfered with. And that would be access to the justice of the peace by any member of the population. The JP office is open. However, they are not processing applications. So for example, if you hit me and the police wouldn't do anything about it, I can file a criminal information against you, and I can file it with the JP office that's open. But since March, they've never been processing applications. So my access to a JP, Justice of the Peace, to file a criminal information against you is zero. So there is a significant essential service that was seriously disrupted and or interfered with.
Mm-hmm.
And because it's a hoax, you know, they did cause that. And so therefore they did commit domestic terrorism and hoax regarding terrorism. Another essential service that was seriously disrupted and interfered with is access to buying food. That was interfered with and disrupted. You probably had different hours of time and you had to wait in line, so it was interfered with, and you had to do it in such a way that maybe the store wouldn't even let you in.
Mm-hmm.
So people with exemptions are being denied access to grocery stores as well as other businesses. Interfering with access to food or essentials must be considered as an attempted murder due to the historical nature of past starvations over the centuries. I claim it's attempted murder also. So deaths and suicides are a direct result, and I accuse Lieutenant Governor and Premier of murder. So that's on hoax regarding terrorism. And if there is a death in the hoax or in the terrorism or hoax regarding terrorism, it becomes life in prison, and there is a death. We can just say just from the suicides alone that are lockdown suicides, but then that also becomes murder as well. So I also accuse the Lieutenant Governor for breach of trust. That there is multifaceted. If you take the size of the Ontario debt, which could be around, say, $350 billion, we were not able to get to a balanced budget, let alone a surplus of $250 million. But if we got to $250 million surplus every year from now on, it would take about 1,400 years to pay off. So, you know, somebody, you know, if you have children and they have children and they have children and they have children all the way to 700 years from now, those children will be paying for the lives of those who lived and died now, which is fraud. Yeah, that's a very disorderly kind of thing, for which, you know, I do accuse Lieutenant Governor of disorderly conduct. Yeah. Also, Section 126 of the Canadian Criminal Code, disobeying a statute. Section 7.0.2 bracket 1 of the Emergency Management Civil Protection Act states, I'm just going to speak it loosely, that the purpose of making orders in this section in times of declared emergencies, right? So that's one part of the phrase. The purpose of making orders in this section in times of declared emergencies. And then after that, the other half of that is in a manner that is subject to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms was violated in so many ways, and I'm just going to pick a very obvious one, and that is the right to the gaining of a livelihood. That would be Section 6, subsection 2, subparagraph B, the right to gaining of a livelihood. So they disobeyed a statute. Everybody's disobeyed a statute, but it's the Lieutenant Governor's orders that created the disobeying of the statute criminal code conduct. So I accuse the Lieutenant Governor of disobeying a statute, Section 126 of the Canadian Criminal Code, and I've been asking the police to lawfully take into custody the Lieutenant Governor and Premier for a violation of Criminal Code Section 126, disobeying a statute.
Yeah, I think what
there are
you
many
hit
other
on here,
disobeying a statute violations.
Yeah, I was just going to say, ER, what you hit on here that I think is so important is to keep bringing it back to the fact that everything that's happened since has all stemmed from the declaration of emergency signed by the lieutenant governor, and that is being held up in further documents that have been written as the justification for more measures. So that is your central key document that, and the person behind that is your lieutenant governor.
Yes, if I ordered somebody to be killed, or if I ordered somebody to steal something, or if I ordered somebody to do something that looked like it was lawful, I'm still responsible. But the lieutenant governor of all people should understand the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So Section 19 of the Canadian Criminal Code, ignorance of law is no excuse for committing the crime. That's basically it. So the lieutenant governor has no lawful excuse. The lieutenant governor also committed misconduct, allowed, and should know by now, because the deaths are classified as COVID, the coroners are involved in fraudulent death certificates. So coroners, I don't want to pick on the coroners, I want to pick on the lieutenant governor, because once we put the lieutenant governor in prison for life, and anyone else who does this kind of thing in prison for life, then we can fix the rest of what's going on. So I also accuse the lieutenant governor of Section 176 of the Canadian Criminal Code, obstructing religious services and gatherings for good or moral purposes. Section 2, subsection C of the Charter is got to do with religious worship and gatherings. Basically, I think it's freedom of assembly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Section 180, I accuse the lieutenant governor of Section 180 violation of the criminal code, nuisance. So suicides are up significantly, homelessness, domestic abuse, loss of gaining of livelihood, significant increase in drug abuse. The comfort of the public was severely affected by the declaration of emergency that was not demonstrably justified. So the part of Section 180 of the criminal code is the comfort of the public was severely affected. The health of the public was endangered. Isolation creates suicide, which is murder. Lockdown suicides become murder. Section 229 of the Canadian Criminal Code.
Mm-hmm.
And I accused the lieutenant governor of murder, and I asked the police anywhere in Ontario to lawfully take into custody and charge the lieutenant governor, Elizabeth Doswell, with murder and participate in prosecutions against Elizabeth Doswell, the lieutenant governor, so that Elizabeth Doswell can be properly prosecuted in a criminal court and put in prison for life.
Yeah.
Also, Section 218 of the Canadian Criminal Code. The lieutenant governor and premier, but let's focus on the lieutenant governor, through failing to act and safeguard and protect, it did recklessly endanger the lives of children. Masks and social distancing damage children, almost everyone. Children have become docile on school buses and within schools. Carbon dioxide trapped within a mask will do this. Carbon dioxide causes active rats, rodents, animals to slow down, then lie down, and then die painlessly. Carbon dioxide is listed as a toxic substance, item number 74 in Schedule 1 of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. Oxygen deprivation occurs also when the mask becomes a CO2 retention chamber. And children are berated by other children for not wearing a mask, even while exempt. So I accuse the lieutenant governor of reckless endangerment of children, Section 218, not just from the masks, not just from carbon dioxide, which is used to euthanize animals painlessly, but also because of the lack of respect for the gaining of a livelihood, Charter Section 6.2b, protected right, causing families to not work, possibly losing their homes, possibly having more domestic violence or child abuse. This endangers the life of a child. So there are many aspects to Section 218 of the Canadian Criminal Code of reckless endangerment of children. And so I again asked the police in Ontario to immediately, and I mean immediately, not tomorrow, but right now, to lawfully take into custody the lieutenant governor and the premier for section 218 of the Canadian Criminal Code, reckless endangerment of children. Also, I accuse the Lieutenant Governor of criminal negligence because the Lieutenant Governor did neglect and wantonly and recklessly neglect to hear any other voices from the population that the measures were harmful to the overall population. There is no due process. Due process requires hearing both sides. There never was due process. I might get into that a little bit later. Section 229 of the Canadian Criminal Code, I've said this already, but the Lieutenant Governor has committed murder by having lockdown suicides become murder because the declaration of emergency was never once discussed properly for resources, criteria, or circumstances. Never once was it proven that a ghost exists, nor was the virus ever isolated and purified. Section 245 of the Canadian Criminal Code, I accused the Lieutenant Governor of Section 245 of the Canadian Criminal Code, and that would be forcing anybody to breathe in carbon dioxide, which is a known toxic, noxious substance. So again, carbon dioxide is listed as a toxic substance. It's item number 74 in Schedule 1 of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. Carbon dioxide painlessly kills and without notice or warning. So I again accuse the Lieutenant Governor and ask the police to lawfully take into custody the Lieutenant Governor and Premier for a violation of Section 245 of the Canadian Criminal Code, and to do this immediately and participate in the prosecutions. So then also torture, Section 269.1 of the Canadian Criminal Code.
Yeah.
Every element of torture.
Go. Let's. And I want to hold on to the torture.
Go on.
So it's part of the criminal code, but let's talk about that because you have expanded on that in your document, and I think that's really important. But let's just touch on it briefly here, and then we'll go into the Hamilton Mask Bylaw and your information regarding that, because that's also got some pretty interesting stuff.
Okay. So if I can continue with all the accusations quickly.
Yes, absolutely.
So torture, every element of torture has been satisfied. Every element of torture has been satisfied. And so Section 269.1, I accuse the Lieutenant Governor of torture, and I ask the police to lawfully take into custody the Lieutenant Governor and Premier for 269.1 criminal code violation, torture. And Section 269.1, I believe it's subparagraph 3 or C, states that there is no defense for torture, even in a public emergency. Okay. Section 345 of the Canadian Criminal Code, extortion. I mean, that's an easy one. I also have 361, false pretense, and number of cases, unreliable PCR tests, the caseload of hospitals, which are known to be empty. There's videos of hospital staff dancing all over the world. People here in Ontario are verifying the hospitals are empty. Nurses are saying it. Fraud, Section 380 of the Criminal Code. The accused did nothing to protect children and teens from extreme debt level. They acted outside of statutory authority to put babies born hundreds of years out from now into debt, and the lives of people who have lived and died many years before them. These children and teens 700 years from now or whatever will be forced to pay for it. Section 423, intimidation, as there's coercion through threats of excessive fines for non-compliance of these non-demonstrably justified measures. 429, willfully causing emergency. The Lieutenant Governor did willfully cause affected rights and freedoms to be violated on a grand scale by way of order and the action in support of orders. And then Section 430, this is the last one in my document here, mischief. An extreme amount of property was interfered with in a variety of ways. Properties were rendered useless, inoperative, or ineffective. That would be businesses, churches, vehicles, etc. So I again accuse the Lieutenant Governor of criminal code violation, Section 430, mischief, and I asked the police to immediately lawfully take into custody and participate in prosecuting the Lieutenant Governor for mischief, as properties were rendered useless, inoperative, and ineffective. Also,
Yeah.
just beyond that,
Mhm.
in the documentation, it does have wording for progress indicators for September 2020 put out by the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, stating that the United Nations, including WHO, conducts at least 2 system-wide training and simulation exercises, including one for covering deliberate release of a lethal respiratory pathogen. Training and simulation exercise. This is what we are in.
Mhm.
This is a hoax.
Mhm.
So it even further proves. Okay,
Yeah,
go ahead.
yeah, and I think there's really good evidence as well that a lot of people can easily access that, back up all of these charges. And this is a good outline for people to see exactly what's contained in the criminal code and what's been violated. So let's talk about the Hamilton Mask Bylaw. And one of the first things you mentioned in your document is what
Okay.
exactly an establishment is. So I wonder if you could talk about what you've written about
Okay.
this bylaw.
Okay, I didn't expect to talk about that one in particular. However, I can do what I can to answer that.
Okay.
The thing that I do know is that I can say off the cuff without having to go into it
Hmm.
is that if you have an exemption, that the bylaw rules don't apply to you.
Right.
So in other words, you can just carry on as if nothing's going on.
Right. And there are
And the
exemptions
bylaw officers
included.
are no longer enforcing the bylaw, nor are the police.
Hmm.
They're not helping. They're not helping. So, we have a lot of culprits here.
Right. Yeah.
But
So
the big one is the lieutenant governor, and I'm going to stick with murder.
right. So since let's skip that
Yeah.
one. But the main point, I guess, with the bylaw that you've written about, you do make a clarification about what an establishment is and also the exemptions, because the exemptions are
Okay.
mentioned in the bylaw, and anybody who does not abide by those exemptions or notify people that there are exemptions is also in violation of the bylaw itself.
Mhm.
Okay, so let's go on
Exactly.
to um,
Exactly. Thank you.
yeah, and let's talk about, let's see here. We're going to talk about torture and coercion, but you have mentioned as well the crimes against
Okay.
humanity. So I put in the slide here
Right.
in international law from the International Criminal Court, the Rome Statute, Article 7, that defines what crimes against humanity can be acknowledged as. So we've got here some of the things that you've mentioned, such as murder. Enslavement would be, anybody forced to work off of a debt that was created years before they were ever born. You've got imprisonment or other severe
Mm-hmm.
deprivation of physical liberty in violation of fundamental rules of international law.
Mm-hmm.
Torture is included in there. You
Mm-hmm.
also have the
Mm-hmm.
persecution of any identifiable group or collectivity. So anybody who's being
Mm-hmm.
identified as a
Mm-hmm.
anti-masker or, anti-vaxxer, then they're being encouraged to be shamed
Mm-hmm.
and, forced degraded treatment. We've also got other inhumane acts of a similar character intentionally causing great suffering or serious injury to the body or to mental or physical health.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about,
Right.
you've expanded on torture and coercion in your document. And I think that's really important because in international law, for the Convention Against Torture and Cruel, Degrading, and Inhumane Treatment, if there is a charge or an allegation of torture, the enforcement agencies that exist in a state that has signed this, that's a party to this convention, they are required to immediately investigate and immediately hold the person who is alleged, who these allegations are against, while they do their investigation. So just to keep that in the back of your mind, and we'll let
It's also in
ER talk about this. Yeah.
it's also in the Police Services Act.
Right. Yeah. And
The
I
Police
think
Services Act of Ontario.
that's right.
It's their duty to apprehend people that may be lawfully taken into custody.
Hmm. So
So
let's, yeah,
we don't
we're
need
going to
any other
come,
bodies, which yes, thank you.
yeah. Yeah, we're going to come
Yes.
to the duties of our
Yeah.
enforcement agencies, and we're going to specifically look at, the Police Services
Mhm.
Act of Ontario, the RCMP Act. But before we get to that, let's expand on the torture
Mhm.
and coercion that you wrote about.
Okay, so I have here the Biderman's chart, and every element of the Biderman's chart on coercion has been satisfied.
Mm-hmm.
Isolation, that's a no-brainer.
Mm-hmm.
Monopolization of perception,
Yeah,
humiliation and
absolutely.
degradation,
Mm-hmm.
exhaustion,
Mm-hmm.
threats, fine you, put you in jail, hurt you even. You've seen the videos of police officers hurting people. Occasional indulgences, demonstrating omnipotence. And that's a huge one. That's like, I'm God. And anything you say, no, that's just your interpretation. Or they don't listen. And so I've come to this I've come to this down this avenue for a reason. I'll get to that in a second. And then forcing trivial demands. That would be forcing people to wear masks when they know masks don't work. So I've come down this road because I have actively been trying to stop a large number of things that I believe to be were criminal or just unethical or immoral or unjust. Writing, speaking to members of parliament, anybody, police, you name it. I've been doing it for a very long time. And the only way that I can see this to be stopped is to put them in handcuffs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's what I'm here to do. I'm to put
Yeah.
the lieutenant governor in handcuffs. And I ask everyone to do the same with the same level of intensity and 200 times more than what I'm doing, please.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Okay,
I
so
think it's
is there
important.
anything else you want to touch on torture? Because I mean,
Yeah.
it is evident. It's self-evident.
Yeah. Well, what's important to
But
talk
please,
about, I think,
let's go on it as much as you want.
yeah, what you mentioned about you've gone down other avenues of writing to officials of trying to get some response, which you should have as an individual citizen in a free society. If we existed in a free, just, and peaceful society that respects and protects and fulfills the fundamental inalienable human rights that we all have, then if you have
And the rule of law, and
and
the rule of law,
yeah, and the rule of
and the rule of
law,
law.
that's right. And the laws
Mm-hmm.
should not violate those inherent rights and freedoms. Otherwise, they shouldn't be there. So what's interesting is that you've taken those steps, but we have to understand that there are certain people who are not compelled by compassion or empathy, and all they will do to change direction or to change their actions is if there are consequences, and they have to be direct consequences. So it's not an appeal to
Mm-hmm.
try to change a way of thinking. If that's not possible, if all those routes have shown that this isn't working, then we already know that you need to do direct action. You need to show there are actual consequences for what you're doing. Otherwise, they'll continue to do what they're doing and get away with it. So yeah, with the torture,
That's
you
right.
outlined in there, you had actually a good section in your document about what has applied for torture in this. And what's interesting as well, you stated the enforcing of trivial demands. And one of them is wearing the mask. Now, it is a
Yes.
trivial demand, but it's also a component of physical and psychological torture.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder
Yes.
if you want to talk about, if you
It's
remember what
abuse.
you've written in there.
Well, there's so much. My whole focus is to get the police to go to where Elizabeth Doddswell lives or works immediately, and to lawfully take Elizabeth Doddswell and the Premier into lawful custody and charge them with criminal code offenses, as I mentioned. So I'd have to kind of refresh myself, and if you can help me, I'd be more than happy
Yeah.
to to go along with it. So just
Let me
please
just
help me
pull
here
up.
on this one,
Yeah,
because
let me just pull
my
up that
focus is,
document. So
because I have it in front of me too.
oh, okay. All right. So, I mean, what I've gone over, I've looked at some of the international documents, like to specifically look at torture and crimes against humanity, and I think
Mhm.
we'll have to talk about that as well. Um, but let me just get down to. I actually have a definition here, so why don't I go ahead and read that definition of
Yeah.
yeah. Okay.
Mhm.
So here we go. So, in the Covenant Against Torture and Cruel, Degrading, or Inhumane Treatment, I have the definition of torture. It's Article 1 that states that it is any act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person for such purposes as intimidating or coercing him or a third person, or for any reason based on discrimination of any kind, when such pain or suffering is inflicted by or at the instigation of or with the consent or acquiescence of a public official or other person acting in an official capacity.
Mhm.
Now, it states in there
Yes.
that unless it's inherent in lawful sanctions, but again, I'll go back to what I said that if any law is in violation of your human rights, then they are by definition unlawful, right? So that kind of explains itself.
Correct.
Yes.
Totally correct. And that's what makes murder stick.
Mm-hmm.
What you just said is why murder makes isolation suicides or lockdown suicides. That's what makes it murder.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I'm asking the police, if you're listening, to lawfully take into custody Elizabeth Doddswell
Yeah.
and charge her with murder, Section
Yeah.
229 of the Canadian Criminal Code, subsection C.
Right. And I think the other thing to
Immediately.
touch on here is that as I mentioned before, I'm going to provide the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms document outlining the harms from the COVID measures, because it has shown that deaths
Oh,
due to the COVID measures outperform any deaths that have been listed as COVID deaths by 12 to 1. So all of that data is freely
uh-huh.
available on the government websites, their own websites. So that can be easily found for anybody who is behind saying verification, saying that
Mm-hmm.
we are going to continue with this process. We've reviewed all the data, but we're going to
Mm-hmm.
continue with this process. All right.
Mm-hmm.
So let's
Yep.
go. I just want to touch
So
on,
also, if I just,
yeah,
yep. Mm-hmm.
you go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to I just want to quickly say, as we go into where you want to go, it's disorderly conduct by the Lieutenant Governor, and Section 17 of the Mental Health Act in Ontario allows a police officer to take Elizabeth Doddswell into custody and bring her into a physician.
Mm. Yeah, I will have to say that I'm not in full support of that, because that Mental Health Act
Sorry, I
is
didn't
in,
mean.
yeah, it's enforcement of a medical procedure, and I don't think that we should be going down that road.
And that's fine.
Yeah. All right.
That's
So
fine.
one of
Yes.
the things I want to connect up to with what you're talking about with torture is just look at this definition of
Mm-hmm.
what somebody uses to distract or deceive people. So these are deceptive and coercive tactics that in psychology they say are used by narcissists, psychopaths, sociopaths. They're basically used to create confusion in a person, to make them not trust themselves, to make you
Mm-hmm.
compliant to whatever they want you
Mm-hmm.
to do for them. So
Yes.
anybody in the audience, you can look
Mm-hmm.
this up yourself. But just notice like some of these things that you'll have seen: the gaslighting, projection, nonsensical conversations,
Mm-hmm.
blanket statements and generalizations, deliberately
Yes.
misrepresenting another's thoughts
Mm-hmm.
and feelings, nitpicking and moving the goalpost. So we had flatten the curve, and that was supposed to be for
Yes.
2 weeks, and that goalpost
Mm-hmm.
keeps moving on and on.
Mm-hmm.
Changing the subject to evade accountability,
Mm-hmm.
covert and overt threats, name calling, and destructive conditioning.
Mm-hmm.
We've also got
Yep.
smear campaigns. And
Uh-huh.
then what's interesting is the love bombing or buttering you up, which is basically if you're complying with them, they tell you how wonderful you are, how good you are, and then they'll break you down and say
Mm-hmm.
how you're not
Yeah.
following their orders and you're such a
Mm-hmm.
bad person.
Uh-huh.
Preemptive defense, basically when they
Mm-hmm.
say trust me, or like make out to be I'm good, you don't have to question anything I do. And triangulation is bringing
Mm-hmm.
another person in, bait and feign innocence, boundary testing and hoovering. And this is something that I mentioned earlier, that highly manipulative people don't respond to empathy or compassion. They respond to consequences.
Right.
So the other thing that's interesting
Exactly.
is the condescending sarcasm and patronizing tone. And I know that the mayors in Ontario who have come across the Stand for Thee group were, I guess, on Twitter making fun of this group of parents who were coming out to say that what they were doing is criminal and that they should be arrested. So you have this
Mm-hmm.
condescending tone towards a group of your constituency,
Mm-hmm.
and then the shaming and control,
Mm-hmm.
which are huge right now.
Mm-hmm.
Shaming and control.
Yes. 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 Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, wow. I mean, that was really good what you just said. And the point I want to make out about that,
Yes.
I view the lieutenant governor and premier, more the lieutenant governor. I view the lieutenant governor as a T-Rex or a velociraptor let loose in a city of 2 or 4 or 8 million people. And so if that is ever the case, that velociraptor or T-Rex must immediately be neutralized and set aside. Now, you would deal with a T-Rex very differently than a human being, right? You're not gonna, all you need to do with Elizabeth Doswell is have a police officer go up to her and say, ma'am, can I speak with you? Will you please come and follow me? We're gonna go take you to the station and talk, whatever, right? A
Hmm.
T-Rex is very different, but both need to be isolated because both are severely dangerous to the population.
Right.
And narcissists, psychopaths, they don't stop. They don't stop. Just
Yeah,
like a T-Rex would not stop. You
that's
can't
right.
say to a T-Rex, hey, over at Young and Dundas, quit eating that person. There's a restaurant down there that has a whole bunch of food that's going to waste. You can eat all that food. Just let that person go. That T-Rex can't hear.
Hmm.
Just the same as all of these officials, and I'm going to focus on the lieutenant governor, can't hear or isn't seeing or doesn't care and will keep going because by now you would have thought that the lieutenant governor, by order, should have revoked an order,
That's right. Yeah.
not
And I
extended
think
orders by
I
order.
think what's interesting is
So
that
we
we've
have a
had,
dangerous.
yeah, and what I
Mhm,
want to touch on now is we're going to look at the duties of enforcement agencies, because we've had the Justice Center in
right.
Alberta apply
Mhm,
for an injunction, which is one method you can do if the lawyers are involved and if the courts are taking cases. Then you can apply for an injunction while you're waiting for the court to hear the case, which immediately removes the powers of that
mhm,
person, such as the lieutenant governor. You could have them
mhm,
not be able to do what they do. Nobody recognizes anymore that they have any authority in this moment. And that injunction can
mhm,
happen. But I want
mhm,
to talk about what's happened. So we have enforcement agencies, we have avenues that should be open for recourse, but are not. So let's talk about that with
mhm,
attention to the Police Services Act in Ontario and the RCMP Act, which is a federal one.
mhm. Right. Okay, so let's just touch on the RCMP because that's a shorter discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the RCMP Act, the way the RCMP can act is under section 18 of that act, under duties of an RCMP officer. And it's quite simple. It basically says, and I'm looking for it as we speak here. So I'll just read the pertinent part of section 18A. The preservation of the peace, the prevention of crime and of offenses against the laws of Canada and the laws in force in any province. So the RCMP should be all over this, especially since there's never been any disclosure, sworn or otherwise, even in the report of the declaration of emergency, never once discussed the resources in question and nor the criteria nor the circumstances that required the lockdown. So therefore it's a hoax. They should have been all over this from day one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's all I have to say about the RCMP. I can say a lot more about the police.
Well, why don't we do that? Because I want to,
So
we're going to
yes, the
finish up
RCMP.
now. And I do
Mhm.
want to keep this, like, I'm going to keep this
Yep.
concise for people because I know everybody listening, this is a lot of information. And again, I just want to mention, I am going to link up this document. So please go and read it. But I do want to talk about Police Services Act
Mhm.
because they are the people on the ground. And this is for Ontario specifically.
Mhm.
They're the ones who are enforcing these measures that are illegal.
Mhm. Right. So the Police Services Act in section 1, subsection 2, the importance of safeguarding the fundamental rights guaranteed by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Human Rights Code. That's it right there. And because the declaration of emergency was done, it's supposed to be done in a manner that is subject to the Canadian Charter of Rights as per section 7.0.1, 7.0.2 bracket 1 of the Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act, basically saying that all the measures must be in accordance with the charter. And it's the duty of the police to safeguard the charter, and they didn't. Mm-hmm. So they too, I won't say any more, but they too.
Yeah.
So they should be going after the Lieutenant Governor, Elizabeth Doddswell. They should have been going after Lieutenant Governor right from day one. And if not from day one, from day 31 or from day 61, or from the time where Adamson's barbecue, where they had an excessive amount of police officers there for a guy trying to feed his family, which is risking reckless endangerment of children because that guy may not be able to feed his kids.
Right.
And so many others have recklessly endangered, had their children recklessly endangered by the Lieutenant Governor and Premier and others. But I'm going to focus on the Lieutenant Governor, Elizabeth Doddswell. So the duties of the police, and it even states so in a Supreme Court ruling in 2019, Coercion versus RMT, or I don't remember who, but the judge also stated that the police must know their duties and safeguard the charter rights. So section 42 of the Police Services Act, the duties of a police officer, well, in subsection 2, the police officer has authority to act as such throughout Ontario. And subsection 3, a police officer has powers and duties ascribed to a constable at common law. Anywhere in Ontario, a police officer could have gone up to the Lieutenant Governor and lawfully taken into custody, detained, questioned, and charged the Lieutenant Governor, any and every police officer. And that would include the Ontario Provincial Police as well, for which, where are they? So, yeah, so there's more about the police services. But so what I've been doing when I'm on these marches, I state when I speak, my reason for being here is to safeguard the fundamental rights and freedoms in the Human Rights Code, which just happens to be your duty under section 1.2 of the Police Services Act. And I'm here to help you safeguard the fundamental rights and freedoms in the Human Rights Code. And one suggestion I have for you, police officer, is you can use section 15 of the charter or criminal code, but you can use section 15 of the charter, equal benefit and equal protection of the law. So that would mean that the Lieutenant Governor is not above the law. The Lieutenant Governor did commit criminal code offenses, especially murder, section
Mhm.
229, subsection C, because isolation suicides become murder. And so I try to give the police a way to lawfully take into custody a very high-ranking human being that they don't want to do, because police officers, as I stated, if I say speak out, it's a career-ending move. Or I have a family, I need my paycheck. Okay. Now, if we want to talk about that, that would be breach of trust, where a police officer is not acting out of a self-interest and neglecting a duty. That's breach of trust. Breach of trust has one of the highest or most strongest punishments
Mhm.
that, and police officers are committing breach of trust among disobeying a statute. They're disobeying their own statute.
Mhm. Yeah, in a way, I
So
mean, I
I don't want
know
to focus
this.
on the police. I want the police to lawfully take into custody.
Mhm. Y- Yeah, in a way, it sounds.
Yeah, go on.
I don't mean to sound harsh, but if you agree that your duty is to safeguard the fundamental freedoms of all the people in your community, and you're willfully deciding not to do that, then you have no position to be a police officer anymore. You're no longer a police officer. You're no longer somebody who is upholding and safeguarding the fundamental freedoms of
Right.
all those people in your community. Now you're just a paid agent of a state that is
Mm-hmm.
basically dictatorial. That's all you are. I'm sorry, but that's it.
Mm-hmm. A criminal, a criminal,
Mm,
a criminal, because they're paid to take a bullet
yeah. So it just comes down to a
and they're
choice.
beating people up. I'm not saying all cops are beating people up.
No.
Yes,
No,
yes.
and
The
we're
thing
not
is that
saying
they
that,
would have a job if they did this.
yeah. And we're not saying that anybody is a bad person, but
Carry on.
you have to, if you are a police officer, you have to ask yourself, what do you think your duty is? And if you're just there to do a job and you don't
Mm-hmm.
really care about the oath that you took, then that's your choice. But don't really call
Mm-hmm.
yourself a police
Mm-hmm.
officer, because that is, people will assume that you're there
Mm-hmm.
to safeguard and stand up for their fundamental freedoms, that you're there
Yeah.
to serve and protect them. But if you've decided not to do that,
Yeah,
then just recognize that.
mhm. You're too kind.
But
You're too
this
kind
is,
in your wording.
it's just needing to think about it, need to ask
Mm-hmm.
yourself the question. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to end off here
Mm-hmm.
and leave you with some closing statements. But
Mm-hmm.
before that, we keep stressing the
Mm-hmm.
fundamental freedoms of human beings. And I just want to read this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the reason I picked this one is because this is something that universally we recognize as something that we want. It's an aspiration for free societies around the world. So, in their preamble, and we touched on a lot of this, they state that whereas recognition of the inherent dignity, and of the equal and inalienable rights. Now, inalienable means you're born with them and they're not granted to you, they cannot be taken from you. Of all members of the human family, this is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. So, what that implies is when you do not have recognition of that, you do not have freedom, justice, or peace. And whereas disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, and the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people. Whereas it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. And they also state that near the bottom, whereas member states have pledged themselves to achieve the promotion of universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms, So this is important because when they state, if you look up this document more in international law and human rights, that the states party to this
Mhm.
declaration, they have a duty to respect, protect, and fulfill the inalienable, inherent, and equal dignity, freedoms, and rights of all human beings. Anything that's in violation of that is unlawful.
Mhm. Right. So let me just add to that,
Yes.
because Section 1.2 of the Police Services Act discusses safeguarding the fundamental rights guaranteed by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Human Rights Code. The Human Rights Code discusses what you just read.
Mm-hmm.
So the police have the duty in the Police Services Act to guarantee the protection of everything you just read there. So
Absolutely.
yes, it's I believe you read the UN Declaration of Human Rights, but
Yes.
aside from that, it's also the Police Services Act of Ontario for Ontario,
Right. Yep.
as it's their duty.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
disobeying a statute is a criminal code offense, and the police are committing criminal code offenses. I don't want to go there. I want their help.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
so this document,
Yes.
just to
Yes.
finish up here, you said this document you've already given this to some police services boards? Is that correct?
Yes, I have been given these documents to police. Yes, I have. Not just me, but others. Kellyanne Wolf, in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Kellyanne Wolf is somebody who's making 2021 a different year. We plan on visiting 2 police stations per week to hand them the documents that you're discussing.
Mm-hmm.
2 per week. So tomorrow, which today is Monday, the 11th of January. So tomorrow, Tuesday, the 12th of January at 12 noon, Division 52 in Toronto. We're planning to be there to hand the documents that you have access to.
Okay.
And we're going to ask them to lawfully take into custody the Lieutenant Governor and Premier for murder and other crimes.
Mm-hmm. Now
So Waterloo Regional Police have gotten it. Hamilton Regional Police have gotten it. Halton Regional Police have gotten it, as well as other police services, but directly by hand. Hamilton, Halton, Waterloo
okay.
have gotten it by hand, like
Mm-hmm.
one person handing it to another. Yes.
And
Yes.
have any police responded positively to you?
No.
Okay.
No, many people think they're just going to throw it in the garbage. That is what the consensus opinion is, that the police would just throw these documents in the garbage.
Right.
That's what people think of the police.
Mm. Yeah, it really
Yeah.
says something. So I
And
guess,
that would be,
yeah.
well, I mean, the part of the Police Services Act and the regulations, if people are thinking that, it's because the conduct of police is such a manner that they've destroyed the reputation of the police force, and that would be under the regulations a violation, and that would be misconduct by police officers. So the police officers have misconduct over them, but bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I want to help. My reason for being here is to safeguard the fundamental rights and freedoms in the Human Rights Code. And I would like them to use Section 15 of the Charter, equal benefit and equal protection of the law. And they have the lawful excuse to take into custody the Lieutenant Governor and charge her with murder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and at the very least
Immediately.
and at the very least to just listen to the people who are approaching them with respect, without condescending them, and to basically say, yes, I'm
Yeah.
here for you, I hear you, and you're showing also there's evidence, and they can have an investigation. Even if they don't say, well, we'd like to look at
Mm-hmm.
your evidence before we act, then at least they can do that. But if they're not doing that, then, what
Mhm.
recourse do people have other than to say, well, I don't recognize you as a police officer anymore. If you're not serving and protecting me, then you're
Mhm.
not who you say you are, and we'll have to go from
That's
there.
fraud.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Mhm.
Yeah. A
Yeah.
complete
Well,
replacement, not a defunding, a complete replacement.
right, right. And I do know that there are some police who have started speaking out and they've formed organizations. And I would actually encourage people, if you know the names of the organizations who have decided to go public, to share them. And also to, if you know any enforcement people, to have a conversation, to talk with them, to appeal to their humanity, to say, look, there's a problem here, at least question it, at least look at it. I want to thank you, ER, so much for all the work that you've done. I've been in contact
Oh,
with
you're
you
welcome.
since, I believe, since October or November, and the amount of work you've put
Mhm.
into safeguarding people's rights and freedoms has been incredible. So I have your website here, executivereasoning.com, where people can look at the writings that you have. And I'm also going to attach a link to the specific
Mhm.
document we've been discussing. And yeah, thank you so
Great.
much.
Oh, you're welcome. And so please, everybody, police stations, the police, arrest Lieutenant Governor, murder. If you're going to gather, gather at police stations.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.